This is the recording for the Marine Reserves and Local Fisheries Lab. This lab is a simulation exercise. You are going to need to download the simulation either from Brightspace or from the website given on Brightspace to do this simulation. This will take the place of our lab, and it actually was going to be our lab for March 5th, 2018. This is a lab that you can do on your own, but it can also be done in groups of 2 or 3. I have tested out the simulation at my house, and it worked perfectly fine. The simulation can be downloaded from Brightspace. It can also be downloaded directly from the website. The link to the simulation is given in Brightspace. You will need Java in order to do this simulation, and there's a link there on Brightspace to download Java as well. My understanding is that this will work on Macs, but there is some documentation about how to run it on Macs that's available in the zipped or the compressed folder that has the lab exercise in it. And also there's information about it on the link to where the actual lab was downloaded from. We're going to be dealing with fisheries today. When we talk about fisheries, we're talking about the commercial fishing of fish and shellfish. We're talking about this as an industry where fish and shellfish are captured or are caught and then are eventually sold for profit. The simulation is going to deal with commercial fishing only. This is not going to deal with subsistence fisheries people or with individuals. This is going to deal with 2 different fleets, a yellow boat and a blue boat fleet that represent 2 different commercial fishing fleets. And in fisheries, we're catching fish and shellfish in order to get them for meat, but also from the products that we can create from them. We find that some shark skin, some eels, some lampreys, the skin is used as an imitation leather or as imitation alligator skin or something like that. We also create fish meal from fish. This is going to be ground up meal that is then fed to other fish, like we talked about in dealing with fish farming, or is used sometimes in fish food. This is not going to be the fish that are caught for the aquarium trade, however. That's going to be a separate concept that will not be covered by this lab, and I don't think we'll cover it in this class either. We find today that many of our fisheries are overfished, where we are taking fish at a rate that is higher than they can naturally repopulate themselves. So we're taking at a rate higher than the replacement rate, which means we need to protect fisheries. We clearly need to protect them for the fish species themselves to be able to thrive, but we also need to be able to protect them for the fishermen, because this is the way that a lot of people make their livelihood. And even in commercial fleets, you have a lot of individuals where this is where their life and their money comes from, but they may not be the ones getting rich off of the whole thing. We also need to protect fish because by protecting them, we protect their entire ecosystems. Many of them have a very important role that they play in the ecosystem, and protecting our fish populations is therefore important to keeping our ecosystems, our marine ecosystems, healthy. Marine fisheries themselves appear to have reached their global maximum in yield, meaning the amount of fish that we can take out of them, in the last decade, last 20 years or so. We know that local fisheries worldwide are declining. And the problem becomes that many of our small coastal fishermen, our subsistence fishermen, our people that are fishing to feed their families and their community, are also becoming impacted by this as well. They are having to spend more time out fishing. They're having to go further and further from the coast in order to find fish. And because there's fewer fish for them to catch, in part due to commercial fishing fleets being so large and taking so many fish, your smaller fishermen are making less money and their families are overall doing less well than they were 20 years ago. Coral reef fisheries are very specific ecosystems, or are in very specific ecosystems, and are also very different than a lot of our open ocean fisheries. Many of the coral reef ecosystems have species that grow slowly and that may mature sexually later in life than a lot of the others. Therefore, it may take them a longer time to replace their populations. But the big problem in coral reef work is that your communities are very complex, that there's lots of different organisms that live there, some that are active at night, others that are active during the day, some that live in some areas and not others. And if you lose one member of that ecosystem, one member of that community, there may be consequences that are much higher than would be expected. And because coral reefs tend to be in shallow waters and they tend to be close to shore, they, like estuaries and salt marshes and mangrove forests and lagoons, are highly susceptible to overfishing and habitat degradation. People are right there. It's easy to go fish in those places. So they do it. And then with the pollution coming from the land, the first places it's going to hit are those that are right off of the shoreline. Do you have any idea what a marine protected area is? I'm going to assume most of you are thinking, well, it's someplace in the ocean that is protected. Sure, that's true. A marine protected area is a protected area that's been defined. Their correct definition is an area of land and or sea especially dedicated to the protection and maintenance of marine biological diversity and of natural and associated cultural resources, and managed through legal or other effective means. This is dealing with an IUCN definition from the 1990s. Within a marine protected area, though, the level of protection can vary. And different types of protected areas exist. Sometimes they're parks or reserves. And sometimes they are national or internationally protected areas. Sometimes they're a state area or a regional area. Some are going to be protected at a local scale. Sometimes they exist in linked sets of protected areas. And the level of protection depends upon what you're talking about. Some are shut to fishing, but open to tourism. Some are open to some level of fishing, but not all levels of fishing. Some you can fish if you have the right licenses, depending upon different areas. Some, maybe it's a fishing season, kind of like hunting seasons around here. But the level of protection is going to vary from protected area to protected area. Why do you think we protect marine areas? It's usually because they're somehow important. Either they are important from some sort of an ecosystem perspective. Maybe a protected area is important because of historical reasons. But marine protected areas, it's usually because of the ecosystem or because it's an area where the organisms breed or an area where their young grow up. Because what we know is that for lots of marine species, the adults may live in one area, but they could breed in a different area than where they do their feeding or they're hunting for food, and their young may grow up in an entirely different area. So marine protected areas may need to protect multiple regions in order to really protect the life cycle of an organism. We also protect them on some level for people, because these marine protected areas allow us to see what ecosystems are supposed to be like. And because in a lot of places where people are dependent upon the fish, they're dependent upon these marine protected areas to protect the fish that they need, that give them their livelihood, that will give their grandchildren and their children their livelihood. And in some instances, we're finding that marine protected areas are actually increasing the money coming into regions because of people going to them for tourism. It is difficult to balance the needs of a protected area with the needs of people, though, because you may be taking an area where people used to fish or where they used to go and telling them they're not allowed to be there anymore, or that they do have to restrict their activities. And that's sometimes difficult to say, but it's also very difficult to enforce. but we try our best to balance these with human needs. You're going to be seeing today, how do we balance marine protected areas with human needs, and what is the impact on the species as well as the people? I just gave you this definition on the last slide, but there's for marine protected areas, the IUCN definition. There's lots of types, sizes, and levels. A marine reserve restricts all harvest. A protected area does not restrict everything. So a reserve means that you cannot do any fishing or any taking of shellfish from that area, whereas a protected area has less restrictions when it comes to protection. For today's lab, we have two objectives. The first is that you're going to explore the factors that influence fish population viability and fishery sustainability, because it's important that we balance not only the fish population with the people that are eating the fish, but also the people where this is where their livelihood comes from. And then our second objective is that we're going to experiment with the use of marine reserves as a tool for fisheries management. You're going to see what level of reserve is best, how much of an area needs to be preserved, if it matters where the marine reserve is, and then you're going to look at something that we talk about as a SLOSS debate. SLOSS. Single, large, or several small. Is it better to have one large reserve or multiple smaller ones? You'll see that's one of our exercises today. Your lab is going to consist of interactive simulations. These simulations are simplified. It would be a little bit more complex if you were doing these studies out in the field, but each of these simulations is going to take about 20 years worth of data that it's crunching, which means this would take you a very long time to do if you were to attempt to do all of this. You're going to be able to control different attributes of the fishery, something you could not do in reality, at least not easily. You're going to control the population. You're going to look at where the population is, its mobility. You're going to control fishermen's behaviors. And you're going to be examining different economic factors as you go through. You will be determining the placement and the extent of the marine reserves as you go through and experimenting with them to see how things change. You're also going to look at how the reserves impact not only the fish species, but the fishermen as well. There are 3 different species that you can focus on as you go through this lab, and one of them is the queen conch. You are likely familiar with what a conch looks like. So we have a number of different, or at least what the shell looks like. And you can see the shells here, but if you look closely, you can also see the animal in some of the shells, or at least his eyeballs on the last two at the bottom. And if you're wondering what that bowl is in the middle, that is I believe it's a ceviche made with conch. So this is something that is eaten in Delaware. There are multiple places where you can buy conch fritters. I've never tried them. I heard some people say they were good. I heard others say that they were chewy. So there's that. But conch are large, kind of easy to catch, and they produce beautiful shells. The scientific name is Strombus gigas. Conch are large snails. They may not have looked like snails on the last slide, but they are technically snails that are found throughout the Caribbean. They're important, but they're pretty susceptible to overfishing, which probably doesn't surprise you given the fact that you saw a diver holding 2 in their hand. It's not really easy for these guys to hide, and you can go down and pick them up by hand. They're not as fast moving as we'd like them to be, but it's also really easy to use a trawl to pull behind and kind of scrape them off the bottom and capture large groups at once. They are a protected species. They are considered on one level endangered or potentially endangered. Their fishery is worth millions of dollars each year. So while they're protected, It's because we want to keep their population going so that we can harvest them and we can fish them. As a food, they're eaten either raw or cooked, and their shells, not surprisingly, are used in jewelry, also used in construction, and they're mainly harvested by hand. As a species, they live a long time. They grow slowly, and they reproduce later in life. As an example, they live about 25 years, but they sexually mature after 3 or 4 years of age, which is kind of old for many of the species that we're going to talk that usually think of that are marine snails. They tend to sexually mature rather quickly. We also find with conch that their reproductive output, so the number of good egg and sperm that they produce, increases with age. So the older ones, which tend to be larger, and the ones that we thus want to take with a fishery, and that word take is be the same concept as harvesting. You want to take the older ones. They're larger, they're going to weigh more, there's more food, there's more shell. But if you take those out of the ecosystem, you're also taking the ones that produce the most offspring. They do internal fertilization, and the female can lay over 300,000 eggs. Having said that, most of them will not survive to adulthood. The eggs hatch at 5 days. They stay in the larvae form for 3 to 4 weeks. And there's massive mortality during the first few years of life. Actually, massive mortality during the first few weeks of life, really, at that point. This species is in decline because of habitat loss and pollution, yes, but also because of overfishing. The Nassau grouper is our next. You can see it's a relatively large fish, pretty big mouth for a fish. The Nassau grouper is part of the sea bass family, Epinephelus striatus. It's found in the tropical Atlantic, the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico. The IUCN does list it as endangered because it's had a 60% decline in its population in the last 30 years. Now, it's not the prettiest of fish, but if you like to eat a lot of fish, it's really easy to prepare, it's easy to eat, it has very few bones, so it's kind of ideal fish for consumption. And they're a relatively slowish moving fish. In the Bahamas in 2003, it was $2.7 billion that was gained just from fishing the Nassau grouper. So this is a multi-million dollar industry. And like the conch that we just talked about, Nassau groupers do mature later in life at about 4 to 8 years before they reach sexual maturity. These fish live a long time, well over 20 years. And their highest rate of mortality is in their early ages. As the adults grow older, the rate of mortality is going to decrease. Much like the conch, the reproductive output increases with age. And the largest females are the oldest females. They produce the most eggs. So unfortunately, when we hunt them, when we harvest them, we've removed a large proportion of the animals that produce large, good eggs. These fish, their reproduction involves congregating in the same area and releasing their egg and sperm into the water, which works well for the reproduction, but it actually makes their congregating for reproduction a fishing target. And if we aren't careful with when we fish them, we may actually do a lot of damage because we may harvest them prior to their reproduction time period. We've discovered that with the Nassau groupers, the younger fish look to and follow the older fish to figure out what's going on. They seem to lack reproductive instinct, and they need to be somewhat taught what happens. We believe that with the passenger pigeon, this was part of the downfall of their group, is that the younger ones needed to learn how to be a passenger pigeon from the adult passenger pigeons. And when the adults were being killed off pretty quickly, We believe that that's part of what led to an extinction of the passenger pigeon. And the concern then becomes for species like the Nassau grouper, would that play a role here? We know with the Nassau grouper, it goes through multiple different habitats and foods as it matures, and it can live in a variety of areas, which all will need to be protected to protect the species well. It is a large coral reef fish, and it grows up to 55 pounds. It is part of one of my favorite things to talk about, the coral reef cleaning symbioses. This is when you have the large fish that come to a coral reef and they are cleaned by the small fish and crustaceans there. And the Nassau grouper is one of the ones that does allow the small fish and things to clean the inside of its mouth. For cleaning symbioses, I think the most interesting thing is that the large fish remember which coral reef stops they went to where the small fish and the crustaceans actually bit them and caused harm to them. Additionally, the small fish and crustaceans have a memory of which of the large fish that visited ate their friends. And they don't clean those, the small ones will not clean the large ones that ate their friends, and the large fish will not go back to the cleaning stations where they were injured by the small fish. It's pretty fascinating to think of fish having memories about things like this. Also, for some of you, it's probably fascinating to think about fish having friends that get eaten by other fish. Or maybe if you really love Finding Nemo and the idea of fish having friends is good for you, then perfect. Our last species is the spiny lobster. This is not the lobster that you generally eat, but it is in fact related. Penarellus argus, it is a crayfish more than it is a lobster. It's found in the Caribbean, the West Atlantic, and the Gulf of Mexico. They live in shallow waters, but they also migrate to deeper waters during different times of the year. Their larvae are dispersed in a bunch of different countries, which makes protecting them really difficult. There's very little good international protection for many marine species. The spiny lobster is a multi-million-dollar fishery. These lobsters, they're not endangered, they're not threatened, there's just a lot of them. So they can handle perhaps even more fishing than they're dealing with right now. They grow rapidly, they sexually mature at an early age, they have a high reproductive potential through their entire lifespan, and they disperse through a large area, allowing them protection in a variety of places. It's important that we also talk briefly about fisheries management, because the way that we're doing fishing right now has some very unsustainable fishing practices. If you take marine biology with me next spring, we'll talk more about that then. It's important to note that fisheries are dealing with habitat loss and degradation, which impacts not only the money that's made off of the fishery, but the fish populations themselves. Pollution, coastal development, climate change are all things that are big threats to fisheries. And fisheries management then has to worry about all of these things. We consider also the cascading effects as you fish down the food web. So there's not enough large fish, so you move smaller and smaller and smaller. And then we deal with the problems of trophic cascades, these unintended consequences of how we need to find fish to keep companies in business, to keep people fed. Marine protected areas, or MPAs, are ecosystem-based approaches. These are different from how we've managed things in the past. We are not just protecting a fish, we're protecting the ecosystems that support the fish, which in turn protects all sorts of other species. It protects biodiversity. It also protects genetics better than just protecting a species. It enhances not only the local fishery, but it also allows those protected fish to act as groups that will populate other areas as they have offspring. So it protects and enhances nearby areas. It can protect many species. Everything that lives in the protected area is protected. But marine protected areas are not sufficient on their own. There has to be enforcement, and there have to be other areas that are protected as well, particularly for species that don't spend their entire lives in one area. If you want to learn about what types of fish should you be eating in order to make sure the fish that you're eating are sustainable, I highly recommend the Monterey Bay Aquarium's Seafood Watch link, the first one listed here. It will give you a lot of information about what are good fish to eat, what are bad fish to eat. It talks about sustainability and it's updated all the time. They used to have, and I believe they still do have, something that you can actually print out and put in your wallet that shows you a list of the good and the bad fish. That way when you're out to dinner, you will know what is good to eat, what is not. National Marine Fisheries Service, sorry, that was the National Marine Fisheries Service, is our second link here. That is run through NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. Interestingly enough, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association is run through the Department of Commerce, in part because, almost entirely in part, because of the National Marine Fisheries Service. And fisheries are a commerce activity. I've also have a link here to the UN's work on fisheries. Both the National Marine Fisheries Service and the UN link can give you information on a variety of different fisheries. And then at the bottom, there was a news article from this past fall on Bloomberg about what seafood should you be eating if you want to protect the fish in the ocean. And it talks about, I believe it's the Smartwatch program, and about what chefs are doing in order to protect fishery species. The simulation can be found at the link here. It's also found on Brightspace in a zipped or a compressed folder. You want to read the instructions carefully as you go through and follow them. There are simulation instructions at the beginning. There's also a lot of information to read through about the species. You want to be sure, if you don't know what you're doing, go back and read through. I believe it's on page 16 if you're looking at the Word file, some of the instructions that are there. You're encouraged to do this on your own should you wish, or to work in groups of 2 to 3 to do this lab. Any of those are fine. The instructions are going to tell you that there's 7 levels. We're only doing levels 1 through 6, so you don't have to do level 7. Level 7 is not in your lab manual. It is not in the Word document that I have posted on Brightspace for this, but it is on the website shown here. As you do the exercise, you're going to need to fill in some charts. You're going to need to circle some things. There's also going to be questions for you to answer. The questions that you need to answer are bolded, and you can type out your answers to that and then upload everything through Brightspace. No, your answers do not need to be in sentence form. I will accept phrases, lists, and things like that. You are welcome to use sentences, but if you don't want to, you don't have to. In the simulations, you are going to be able to control a lot of different things. This simulation is going to represent a simplification of the complex population things. And you'll be able to control the population dynamics, the mobility of your target species, fishermen behaviors, and economic factors. The most important thing you're going to be doing is setting up the marine reserves. To do that, you're going to click on the little hexagons and they're going to turn white on their borders. That's going to be protected. You click on them again, the white's going to go away. They're no longer protected. You're going to be examining what happens to the fishery, which means both the fish and the people. There are questions for you to answer. I mentioned a couple slides ago, these are the bolded questions. It tells you here the list of what is due, or what questions you have to answer. There are only questions to answer for levels 2, 3, 4, and 5. That means for levels 1 and 6, it's charts and circling of things to answer. You only have to do this exercise for one of the 3 species. You do not need to do all 3 species. This is an assignment that is due next Monday. If you work in a group, you may turn in a group assignment. You only need to turn in one of that assignment for your group. Just be sure everybody's name goes on it. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.